Car setups are an enigma that can be confusing to get your head around. However, when you do, they can unlock that extra bit of lap time you need to put in faster and more consistent lap times. In F124, we have more car setup options than ever, and it's fair to say that the handling this year is a little bit strange, so a car setup can have more impact than ever before. We have seen significant changes to the handling model after the 1.3 patch, and this has really had a big knock-on effect to car setups and the direction you want to take while creating them. In this video, I'm going to explain every single part of creating a car setup, what each part does, and I'll show you my step-by-step process that I use to create all of our F124 car setups. By the end of the video, you should hopefully have a good understanding how to make car setup changes, along with the confidence to adjust your car setup to achieve specific results. And I just want to say that this setup guide in this video has been created after that big handling patch. While performance is normally the key factor when creating a car setup, there are other reasons for making adjustments. These could be to make the car easier to drive or kinder on your tyres, allowing them to last longer during a race. There's also a pretty big difference between a time trial car setup and a race setup, even more so this year round than ever before. A time trial setup is one designed for a single thing, and that is ultimate single lap performance. These styles of car setups are often biased towards oversteer, and with the current F124 meta, the car will be set up to over-rotate on the corner entry using tools like the off-throttle differential and engine braking. This results in a car that can feel a bit strange to drive, and in a race will certainly prove to be a handful to control and incredibly hard on tyre wear. A race car setup is much different. You do still want to aim for good performance, but you will need to account for tyre wear, consistency, and your top speed, which is a result of your aerodynamic performance. With a time trial setup, you can typically run your front and rear wings much higher. This will improve your cornering speed and can result in faster single lap times. However, in a race, more downforce can actually be a negative. Higher wing angles result in slower straight line speeds, which can make overtaking very hard and even make you vulnerable to being overtaken by cars from behind. It's common that for a race setup we lower our front and rear aero setup to allow our car to be more competitive down longer straights. It can also be beneficial to soften our suspension and use a much less aggressive geometry setup. These changes can result in a car that's easier and more consistent to drive lap after lap, and one that's much better on tyre wear. Although after the big handling update, stiffer suspension setups are quickly becoming the norm even in a race setup. Now I want to jump right into the meat of this video, and that's our process for creating the very best F124 car setup for any situation. On screen now I'll show you our step-by-step creation process, and now I'm going to run through each step in detail, showing you exactly what to change, what to look out for, and what things you should be doing during this step. Now you may notice with each step on screen that I only ever change one thing in between each practice run. And this is because changing multiple parts of your car setup in between runs can make it hard to know what was responsible for the new way in which your car is behaving. For an example, say we adjust our aero setup and our suspension setup at the same time. This could result in us putting in a slower lap time than before, but we wouldn't necessarily know whether it is the aero change or the suspension change that was responsible for this. Only changing a single part of your car setup at once gives us a very clear indication of whether that change worked or not. This makes it much easier to make informed decisions as you progress through creating your car setup. One last thing before I jump into our first step is that I often get asked which game mode I should be using to create car setups. Should they be created in time trial, which is the perfect scenario with unlimited fresh tyres, or should they be created in a live practice session? While time trial is a great place to replicate that perfect scenario, creating a car setup in this game mode may not give accurate results, and that's because the weather and track are at the perfect temperature and there is zero tyre wear. All of these things never really occur during a race weekend. Instead, I do recommend loading up a Grand Prix weekend and setting the weather to clear. This gives you 3 practice sessions on a dry but not perfect track, and it allows you to test your setup with all 3 tyre compounds. If you run out of new tyres while creating a setup, simply save your in-progress setup, exit the session and start a new Grand Prix weekend with the same conditions as before. Then you can continue right where you left off. One very important aspect of creating a car setup is to regularly check your tyre temperatures, and you simply can't do this in a time trial session. Now let's jump into my first step, and that is to always make a few quick adjustments. These include setting a normal brake bias, ensuring your brake pressure is set to maximum, and adjusting your on-throttle differential. Each of these changes just makes the car a little bit more balanced than the default setup. Then immediately after making those changes, I would hit the track for the first time. During the first practice run, you want to complete about 5 laps, as this is enough time to allow the tyres to reach their maximum temperature. You should be focusing on how the car behaves throughout a lap. Is it understeering, oversteering? Do you struggle to apply the throttle without spinning the wheels? All of these are things to mentally note down. And also do pay attention to your lap time to see just how fast you are. Also, during this first practice run, you should open your MFD and check the tyre temperature throughout a lap towards the end of your run. It's always handy to physically note down the tyre temperature for each individual tyre, as we'll use these temperatures to make tyre pressure adjustments in a minute. Now after about 5 or so laps, head back into the pits so we can actually start making our first real car setup changes. The first thing I always adjust is the aero setup. This is one of the most impactful areas of your car setup, and it can dictate how much grip you have through the corners and just how fast you are at the end of the straights. Remember how your car behaved during the first practice run? Now the aero setup can correct some of your unwanted behaviour through the corners. If you found that your car was understeering, you can increase your front wing or potentially reduce the rear wing. If it's oversteering, do the opposite, increase your rear wing a little bit, reduce the front wing. If you're too slow on the straights, try decreasing both front and rear wings simultaneously. And if you're just too slow around the corners, increase both front and rear wing aero. In F124, it's generally better to have a higher front wing angle than at the rear. The recommended gap between the two should probably be around 5 to 15 at most of the tracks, with a common value of around 10 being generally very good at most circuits. The perfect aero setup gives you enough speed to be competitive with other cars down the straights, but also enough downforce so you are pretty fast around corners. I'd recommend comparing your speed through speed traps against the other cars on track, or try following them closely down the straights to see how your straight line speed compares. You can always watch other cars during a practice session using your monitor in the pit lane, and this is a really good way to quickly compare your speeds to others around you. Now after we've made our first setup changes, and before heading back out on track, I would adjust our tyre pressures. This change brings each tyre into the correct temperature window to avoid too much wear or too little grip. I'd refer to your noted tyre temperatures from the first practice run and adjust the pressures to bring them into the working window. In this year's game, the pressures and the temperatures have been switched around, so increasing your tyre pressure will decrease the temperature, while decreasing pressures will increase the temperature, which is the opposite compared to last year's game. The ideal tyre temperature in F124 kind of depends on which compound you're running, but it can range from about 85 degrees all the way up to 105. With the softer tyres, you probably want to run them a little bit cooler, towards that 85-90 degrees, whereas the harder tyres you can run all the way up to 100-105. Although even with the softer tyres, running them all the way up to about 105 degrees, you won't experience too much grip loss. If a tyre is running too cold, it won't be providing the maximum grip available, and it will mean your car will slide about the track a little bit more and you'll feel a little bit less mechanical grip. If the tyres are running too hot, the same sort of thing happens. The mechanical grip starts to fall away and you'll start to slide about the track, which will increase the tyre wear. With our aero setup adjusted, tyre pressures refined, we can head back out on track for another practice run. Select a new set of tyres for a like-for-like comparison with the first run and head out on track. Again, complete a minimum of around 5 laps, paying close attention to how your car handles. It's also worth comparing your lap times against your previous best, as ultimately a good car setup should help you improve your performance. Also, use this practice session to once again check your tyre temperatures to see if they're closer to the perfect temperature range. Don't worry too much about noting the tyre temperature down this time, as we're not going to be adjusting them right away. After returning to the pits once again, we're now going to look at adjusting our suspension setup. Much like the aero, the suspension has a big impact on our car's performance. It will affect how easy or hard your car is to drive, and it can be used to tweak your car's preference to understeer or oversteer. The front and rear suspension setup affects how soft or how stiff your car feels during various moments. Adjusting this can make your car more or less stable, especially over bumps and curbs. It also affects how the weight shifts under heavy braking and acceleration and just how responsive it is. If you go for a softer suspension setup, it'll increase the stability a little bit, but it'll make your car a little bit less responsive. If you do the opposite, go for a stiffer suspension, The responsiveness goes up, but your car can become a little bit less stable, and it can also be a little bit harder on your tyre wear. One of the trends in F1 24, as well as previous F1 games, is to stiffen your front suspension pretty high, then with the rear suspension set it to be pretty soft in comparison. This will create a car that's very responsive, while the rear remains compliant and stable. Being too aggressive with this can cause some unwanted rear stability and oversteer, and if this is the case, you can either soften the front suspension or stiffen the rear a little bit. The anti-roll bars work in a relatively similar way to the suspension, but kind of affect the lateral stiffness while cornering. Making changes to your ARBs greatly impacts your overall responsiveness, as well as stability mid-corner. If you stiffen your anti-roll bars, this will increase the responsiveness on corner entry and the rotation, but it will also increase instability through longer duration corners. Softer anti-roll bars mean generally more stability through corners, but a little bit less responsiveness and initial rotation. Now, the offset between front and rear is quite important as well. If you go a stiffer rear anti-roll bar and a softer front, this will increase your initial rotation, it will reduce understeer, but it can result in more oversteer, making your car a little bit harder to drive. If you go with the stiffer front ARB and a softer rear, this will give you more overall stability, but increase the tendency to understeer a little bit. Much like the suspension setup, an offset between front and rear ARBs is common in F1 24, although not normally as extreme. Your ARBs should almost always be set with the front anti-roll bar stiffer than the rear, which will promote overall stability. In F1 24, the anti-roll bars can often be set incredibly high, sometimes right up to 2121. This is normally the optimal route for most time trial setups, with race setups often softening the rear anti-roll bar. A setup of say 2121 will result in better performance on the corner entry and mid-corner phase. However, you do need to be cautious at tracks with longer corners like say China or Suzuka. Setting your ARBs too stiff can result in the rear of the car being overwhelmed and giving way on you mid-corner. To combat this, I often recommend softening the rear anti-roll bar or softening both front and rear ARBs to make your car generally more stable in race trim. The final part of the suspension setup is the ride height, and this also can affect stability, especially if your setup is too low, causing your car to hit the track or the curbs. You will, however, want to set your ride height as low as you can get away with without too much contact with the track. A lower ride height will provide more downforce, and especially with this new generation of ground effect Formula 1 cars, it's really important. Increasing your ride height can make your car a bit more stable, but it will produce more drag, which slows your car down and produces less overall downforce. You should aim to set the ride height as low as possible until you experience bottoming out or too much contact with the track surface. You can generally hear this while on track, or you'll feel the car become a little bit unresponsive, especially over curbs and bumps. Also, if you notice your top speed suddenly decrease or is much lower than other cars around you, this could be due to your car rubbing the track too much and mean you need to increase your ride height a little bit. There is also an important correlation between ride height and suspension stiffness. The stiffer you set your front and rear suspension, the lower you can set your ride height. And this is because a stiffer suspension will allow for less compression and vertical movement than softer suspension would. You can experiment with lowering your ride height as you stiffen your suspension up. With the suspension setup adjusted, it's time for another practice run. Like the previous stint, you should compare your overall pace to your car's stability and notice if you experience any unwanted understeer or oversteer or general instability. If you do experience any of this stuff, you can return to the pits and rework your suspension setup until you feel comfortable. If you are happy, you can move on to the next part of our car setup, which is the suspension geometry. You can adjust the toe and camber at both the front and rear of your car, and these will really heavily impact your tyre wear and also affect responsiveness, stability, and drag to some degree. Now, the camber is the term given to the angle of your tyres when viewed from the front of the car. Formula 1 cars are always set up with the tops of the tyres pointing in, which is called negative camber. The more the tyres lean in at the top, the more potential lateral grip you'll have while cornering. This is because as your car turns into a corner, the weight shifts to the outside of the car, and this leans on your outside tyres. This will cause the tyre angle in relation to the track to change and more of the tyre's surface to come into contact with the track. More negative camber provides more potential grip while cornering, but it can also overheat your tyres more mid-corner, resulting in higher temperatures. One of the key downsides of adding too much negative camber is that it can reduce the overall contact patch with the track when travelling straight. This can limit your straight line grip, making it easier to lock a wheel under braking or result in lower top speeds compared to a more neutral camber setup. With pretty much all F124 car setups, the performance gain from running the most amount of negative camber will almost always outweigh any potential negatives, and this often results in a camber setup all the way to the left on both front and rear. The only reason you would really move away from this approach is if tyre wear really is just too much of an issue to manage with other parts of your car setup, or if you're hunting for better traction and braking performance. Although the gains in these areas won't often outweigh the potential cornering performance that a left-to-left camber setup offers. Now, your toe setup is the angle of your tyres when viewed from the top. It's essentially how much your tyres point out or in from the car. Pointing out is called toe out, while pointing in is called toe in. Adjusting the toe angle can affect responsiveness, stability, drag and top speed, as well as tyre temperatures. If you increase the toe out at the front, this will increase the responsiveness, but it will also reduce stability, it'll increase excess drag as your tyres won't be pointing straight, and this can cause increased tyre temperatures. If you set more toe in at the rear, this will increase stability a little bit, but it will reduce responsiveness, kind of counteracting that toe out of the front. This also increases drag as once again your tyres aren't pointing straight, which again will increase your tyre temperatures at the rear of the car. But you can use the toe setup to address some unwanted characteristics that may have resulted from other setup changes. If your car lacks a bit of stability, try increasing the rear toe. If your car understeers and isn't responsive while turning, try increasing the front toe. But if your car is too slow on the straights, you can reduce your front and rear toe, and this can also bring down your tyre temperatures. Much like the camber, in F124 it's normally always more beneficial to lower the front and rear toe right down to their minimum values. This will lower drag and result in higher top speeds, and because the cars in F124 are already incredibly pointy and responsive, it's often not needed to increase this effect with higher toe out values. You may find yourself adding some toe in at the rear of the car though at certain tracks just to help with stability. Doing this can counter the tendency for your car to step out of line through a corner and can sometimes make the car just that little bit easier to drive. Once again, after making these car setup changes, set a new set of tyres and head out on track for another 5-lap practice run. If at this stage you're starting to run out of tyres, you can progress to another practice session to unlock a few more, or you can even restart the Grand Prix weekend after saving your setup in progress. During this next practice run though, note down your tyre temperatures once again, as we will be making further adjustments to them in the next part. And that next part is all about the transmission. There are some new options available to us with the transmission setup in F124, so we have more control than ever before. Both the on and off throttle differential can now be adjusted by a much greater degree. We have adjustments from 10% all the way out to 100%, while in the previous F1 games we were restricted to 50 to 100%. And there's also a new option called engine braking. Each of these setup options lets us change how the car behaves during certain situations. The on throttle diff will control how locked the rear wheels are under acceleration. Higher values can result in better drive out of faster corners, but more wheel spin at slower corners. Your off throttle differential controls how the car rotates at the entry to a corner. Lower values allow the car to rotate better into corners at slower speed, but setting this too low can result in a car over-rotating and generally feeling a little bit more unstable. The new setup option is the engine braking, and this affects how much the engine will naturally slow the car when you're not accelerating. Higher values will lead to more ERS regeneration each lap, and it will slow the car more aggressively when off throttle, which can lead to better braking performance. However, setting this too high, much like the off throttle differential when it's too low, can cause a little bit of instability and a bit of over-rotation. As a general rule of thumb, lowering your on throttle diff and off throttle diff can be beneficial for stability and consistency during a race. A lower on throttle diff setup can make it easier to find traction at slower speeds, but can also affect performance when accelerating out faster corners. You'll ideally want to increase your on throttle differential as high as you can before you really start to struggle with wheel spin and traction at slower speeds. Lower off throttle differential setups allow your car to rotate a bit better into a corner at slower speeds, and this can help counteract a bit of understeer. However, setting this too low can cause over rotation or instability during the corner. I would recommend setting your engine braking above 50% at most tracks. This will recover more ERS each lap, although remember that there is a cap to how much ERS you can generate each lap. There is also a big correlation between the off-throttle diff, the engine braking and the brake bias, and how each of these affects your overall braking performance. Setting your off-throttle diff lower, your engine braking higher, or your brake bias more rearward will all result in more rotation under braking. Doing all three of these things at the same time will result in a car that feels incredibly unstable during the entry to a corner. You will want to choose which direction you go with and use the other values to balance your car. A lower off-throttle diff, for example, will limit how much engine braking you can run and can require a more forward brake bias. The last real car setup change that we're going to make is the tyre pressures once again. Almost all setup changes will impact how hard your car is on your tyres, meaning we'll need to correct them right at the very end of this setup process. Use the tyre temperatures that you took from your latest practice run, and once again just gradually adjust your tyre pressures up or down for each individual tyre. If you find that you can't control your tyre temperatures through the pressures alone, you can make some adjustments to your car setup to improve your tyre wear. If you want to lower your tyre temperature, you can increase your pressures, soften your suspension, or reduce the amount of toe or camber you're running. To increase the tyre temperature, do the opposite. You can decrease your pressures, stiffen your car, or add more angles of toe and camber. These are the quickest and easiest ways of actually kind of affecting your tyre temperatures. Now, at this stage, you should have a car that is feeling much better than it did at the start. You may have not needed to make large setup changes compared to the setup you started with, or you may have found that you've deviated a lot. Whichever route you take, you should end up with a car that feels comfortable and consistent to drive, while also being fast and competitive. If you feel your car is lacking in any area by this stage, repeat the steps to try and solve any issues. It can sometimes take a really small tweak to a certain part of your setup that you adjusted earlier on, just to bring it all together. Of course, if you are struggling or you don't really like adjusting your car setups, check out our F124 car setup videos, and we have optimized car setups for races for every single track. These can be an excellent starting point for either to hit the track right away, or if you want to tinker with a little bit more. Let me know in the comments below how you're finding F124 and whether you like adjusting your own car setup. Also, hit that like button if you found anything in this video useful, as it will really help this channel grow. And finally, subscribe if you want to be notified when we drop more F124 videos, which we're doing on a daily basis. But for now guys, good luck in the garage and tinkering with your car setups, and I'll see you out on track.